This is the moment the world stopped waiting for America. For years, every nation on earth built their economy around the assumption that the United States would remain the center of global trade. That assumption just died. As of this morning, Sunday, March 8th, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has formally unveiled a $3 trillion alternative economic architecture designed to replace U.S. dominance in global commerce. And the world leaders who just signed on to it aren't fringe players. They aren't protest states. They are our closest allies. They are the nations that built the post-war order alongside us, and they just decided they don't need us anymore. Breaking news from multiple diplomatic sources in Ottawa, Brussels, and Tokyo confirms that nearly 40 nations have committed, in principle, to a unified trade framework that bridges the European Union with the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. This is not a concept paper. This is not a think tank proposal floating around Davos. This is a signed framework with binding timelines, rules of origin agreements, and coordinated tariff schedules. The combined GDP of this new bloc exceeds $45 trillion. It covers 1.5 billion consumers, and it was designed from the ground up to function without a single American dollar passing through it. We are talking about the European Union. We are talking about Japan. We are talking about Australia, India, Singapore, Canada, South Korea, Mexico, Vietnam, Malaysia, and a dozen more. We are talking about a constellation of economies that, when linked together, represent roughly 40% of global GDP. For reference, the United States accounts for about 25%. China sits at roughly 18 to 20%. This new bloc, if it holds, would be the single largest economic alliance in human history. And it was born not out of ideology, but out of necessity, out of the wreckage of American trade policy. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how Mark Carney pulled this off. We are going to examine the financial mechanics of the deal, the specific provisions that cut America out, the political fallout inside Washington, and the terrifying question that nobody in the White House wants to answer. What happens to the US dollar when the world finds an alternative? Buckle up. The maps of global power are being redrawn this weekend. To understand why 40 nations just signed onto a Canadian-led economic rebellion, you have to understand what happened in Washington over the past 14 months. It started with tariffs. On February 4th, 2025, President Trump signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and 10% on China, using emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Then came the escalations. Liberation Day on April 2nd, with tariffs displayed on poster boards like trophies, then the 145% rate on Chinese goods, then the 35% hammer on Canada, then the rolling threats against the EU, South Korea, India, and anyone else who looked at the White House sideways. For a year, the world absorbed it. They absorbed the chaos. They absorbed the uncertainty. They absorbed the Supreme Court challenge that took months to resolve. And then, on February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled that tariffs imposed under IEEPA were unconstitutional. The president had overstepped his authority. But instead of backing down, Trump signed a new executive order that same day, imposing a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, then raised it to 15% the next morning. 24 states sued. Over 2,000 businesses filed for refunds on more than $130 billion in illegal tariffs already collected. The U.S. trade system was in constitutional freefall. And here's where it really gets serious. Because while Washington was suing itself, while the customs agency was scrambling to figure out how to refund billions, while the Treasury Secretary was going on Fox News to defend tariffs that had just been declared illegal, Mark Carney was on a plane. He was in Beijing signing a strategic partnership with Xi Jinping. He was in Qatar meeting with the Emir. He was at Davos telling the world that the old order was over and that middle powers needed to act together because, and this is a direct quote from his speech, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. That line wasn't just rhetoric. It was a battle cry, and the world answered. Within 6 months, Carney had signed 12 new economic and security agreements on 4 continents. He went to Beijing and secured a preliminary trade deal that unlocked $7 billion in agricultural export markets. He forged a comprehensive strategic partnership with the EU, including joining their defense procurement arrangements. He negotiated with India, ASEAN, Thailand, the Philippines, and Mercosur simultaneously. He sent his personal representative to Singapore to coordinate rules of origin discussions with CPTPP members. He doubled Canada's defense spending commitment and launched a $180 billion defense industrial strategy designed to make Canada independent of American military procurement. This was not improvisation. This was a former governor of the Bank of England, a former governor of the Bank of Canada, a man who spent his career understanding exactly how financial systems are built and how they can be rebuilt, executing a plan with precision that Washington never saw coming. Let me explain the financial architecture of what Carney built, because this is where it gets technical, and this is where the real damage to America lives. The framework rests on three pillars. Pillar one is rules of origin accumulation. This sounds boring. It is the most important trade mechanism most people have never heard of. Rules of origin determine the economic nationality of a product. Where was it made? What percentage of its components came from which country? Under the current system, if a Japanese car manufacturer uses Australian steel and Malaysian electronics, the tariff treatment depends on complex bilateral agreements. Under Carney's framework, all participating nations agree to treat each other's inputs as domestic. A car built in Japan with Canadian aluminum, German engineering, and Vietnamese assembly qualifies for preferential tariff treatment across the entire 40-nation bloc. No American input required. No American market needed as leverage. The supply chain routes around the United States like water flowing around a rock. Pillar 2 is coordinated tariff reduction. The EU and the CPTPP nations have agreed to a phased elimination of tariffs on 85% of goods categories within the bloc over the next 3 years. That is a $3 trillion trade corridor operating under preferential terms that American exporters cannot access. American soybeans competing against Canadian canola in the Chinese market. Canada just got a tariff reduction to 15%. American manufacturers trying to sell into the EU, they face a 15% U.S.-imposed tariff on their own imported components, making their products more expensive before they even leave the factory floor. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. Pillar 3 is the one that should terrify the Federal Reserve. It is the creation of parallel settlement mechanisms. Under the current global trade system, roughly 58% of all international transactions are denominated in U.S. dollars. That is the foundation of American financial hegemony. It is why we can run massive deficits. It is why the Federal Reserve's interest rate decisions move global markets. It is why sanctions work. The Carney framework includes a provision for participating nations to settle bilateral trade in their own currencies or through a new multilateral clearing mechanism modeled on the European payments architecture. It is not a replacement for the dollar. Not yet, but it is an alternative. And in economics, the existence of a credible alternative is all it takes to erode a monopoly. Here's what nobody in Washington is talking about. The $3 trillion figure isn't just the estimated annual trade volume of the new bloc. It is the amount of trade that will no longer need to pass through dollar-denominated channels. If even 30% of intra-bloc trade shifts to non-dollar settlement over the next 5 years, that is roughly $900 billion per year in reduced demand for U.S. dollars. That means less foreign buying of treasury bonds. That means higher interest rates for American consumers. That means the mortgage rate in Des Moines, Iowa goes up because Mark Carney convinced the Japanese to buy Canadian bonds instead of American ones. The chain reaction is devastating. Reduced dollar demand leads to a weaker dollar. A weaker dollar makes imports more expensive, which is inflationary. Inflation forces the Fed to keep rates high. High rates strangle the housing market, the auto market, and small business lending. And all of this happens on top of the 15% tariff that is already making every imported good more expensive. The Federal Reserve's own beige book from last week confirmed that U.S. economic growth was already muted in February. Businesses across the country reported increased costs. Some passed them along to consumers. Others simply stopped hiring. The labor market, which had been cooling for months, is now approaching a tipping point. Job openings have fallen below 1 per unemployed worker for the first time since 2021. This is the economic death spiral that trade economists have been warning about for a year, and it just became real. The tariffs were supposed to bring jobs back. Instead, they brought a coalition together, a coalition that just built the exit ramp from the American economy. Now let's talk about what is happening inside the White House, because sources close to the administration describe the reaction as somewhere between panic and denial. The president was reportedly briefed on the Carney framework Thursday evening. His initial response, according to two people familiar with the conversation, was to dismiss it. Canada can't lead anything, he allegedly said. They're a governor pretending to be a country. That language is telling. The president has been calling Canada a state and its prime minister a governor since before his second term began. He rescinded Carney's invitation to join his so-called Board of Peace after the Davos speech. He threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods for daring to negotiate with China. Every escalation was designed to humiliate, and every humiliation pushed Carney closer to the moment we are witnessing today. But by Friday morning, the National Economic Council had prepared a classified briefing showing the projected impact on U.S. exports. The numbers were catastrophic. If the bloc's preferential tariff treatment diverts even 12% of current U.S. export volume to intra-block suppliers, American farmers lose an estimated $40 billion in annual revenue. American manufacturers lose access to supply chains that took decades to build. The semiconductor industry, already reeling from export controls and retaliatory Chinese restrictions, faces a new competitor, a coordinated bloc that can source rare earth minerals from Canada and Australia, process them in Japan and South Korea, and fabricate chips in Vietnam and Malaysia, all under preferential terms that American companies cannot match. The Treasury Department is said to be drafting an emergency response. Options on the table include a unilateral tariff reduction offer to EU nations, an expedited USMCA review to salvage the North American trade relationship, and most dramatically, a direct approach to individual CPTPP members offering bilateral deals designed to fracture the coalition. The strategy is called divide and conquer inside the West Wing. Pick off Singapore, offer Japan a security guarantee in exchange for trade concessions, threaten South Korea with troop withdrawals if they don't abandon the Carney framework. But here's the catch. It won't work. And the reason it won't work is because of something Trump did 14 months ago, when the president threatened to make Canada a 51st state, when he called their prime minister a governor, when he tried to block the Gordie Howe International Bridge, when he threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods for daring to trade with China. He didn't just antagonize Canada, he terrified every middle power on earth. If the United States could treat its closest ally, its largest trading partner, a NATO member, a Five Eyes intelligence partner like this, then no country was safe. The Carney coalition didn't form because the world loves Canada. It formed because the world is afraid of America. And that fear, weaponized by a former central banker who understands exactly how financial systems work, has produced the most significant realignment of global trade since Bretton Woods. Let me tell you what this looks like on the ground, because the abstract numbers don't capture the human cost. A soybean farmer in Illinois is watching the futures market crater because Brazilian and Canadian producers now have preferential access to Asian markets he used to dominate. A small manufacturer in Ohio who makes precision tools for the European auto industry just lost his biggest contract because the EU procurement rules now favor intra-block suppliers. A tech startup in Austin that was planning to expand into the Japanese market just learned that their Japanese partner is restructuring the supply chain to source from CPTPP members exclusively. These are not hypothetical scenarios. These are the conversations happening right now in boardrooms and farm offices across the heartland. And here's where it really gets serious. The political implications. The 2026 midterms are 8 months away. The president's economic approval ratings are already underwater. The tariff refund fiasco, with $130 billion in illegal tariffs that need to be returned, is a daily headline. The Supreme Court defeat was a humiliation. And now this, a global coalition designed to bypass America, led by a man Trump personally mocked, embraced by leaders Trump personally threatened. Imagine the attack ads. While Trump was tweeting, 40 countries were building an economy without us. While your grocery bill went up 12%, Canada was signing deals on 4 continents. While the president was calling allies governors, those allies were replacing us. The Republican coalition is fracturing over this. The business wing, the Chamber of Commerce types, the Koch network, they see the Carney bloc as an existential threat to American corporate competitiveness. They are privately furious. The populist wing, the MAGA base, they see tariffs as patriotic and any criticism as betrayal. But even the true believers are starting to notice that the prices at Walmart are higher and the factory in town still hasn't reopened. Let's talk about what Putin and Xi Jinping are thinking right now, because this is where the geopolitical implications become genuinely dangerous. Putin sees a fractured Western alliance and an America that is losing its economic leverage over Europe. If the EU no longer depends on access to the American market for its prosperity, the US loses its ability to pressure Europe on sanctions, on defense spending, on Ukraine. The transatlantic relationship, the foundation of the post-war order, cracks. Xi Jinping sees something even more strategic. China signed a preliminary agreement with Carney in January, lowering tariffs on Canadian canola, lobster, and other agricultural products. Beijing is positioning itself as a cooperative partner to the Middle Power Coalition, not a member of it, but a friendly neighbor. If the Carney bloc succeeds, China gains access to a new trade architecture that is not controlled by Washington. The leverage that American sanctions provide, the ability to cut nations off from the global financial system, erodes. This is the scenario that the national security community has been warning about for years. Not a military conflict, not a cyber attack, an economic divorce. A world that simply decides it can live without America at the center. And the cruel irony is that it was American policy that made it happen. The Supreme Court has already signaled that the president's tariff authority has limits. The Section 122 tariffs expire in 150 days. 24 states are suing to stop them. The legal architecture of American trade policy is in shambles. And while Washington fights with itself over constitutional authority, Carney is in Tokyo right now, meeting with Prime Minister Takaichi, signing agreements on clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and critical minerals. So how does this end? Let me lay out the scenarios, and none of them are good. Scenario 1, Trump escalates. He threatens to withdraw from NATO. He imposes sanctions on nations that join the Carney bloc. He uses the military as leverage. This accelerates the divorce. It confirms every fear that drove nations to Carney in the first place. Scenario 2, Trump capitulates. He offers tariff reductions. He tries to rejoin the framework on terms set by other nations. America enters the bloc not as a leader, but as a participant. The humiliation is unbearable for a president who built his brand on winning. Scenario 3, paralysis. Washington does nothing. The bloc consolidates. American market share erodes slowly, then suddenly. By 2028, the next president inherits an economy that has been structurally diminished. The damage is permanent. Watch for the EU parliamentary vote on the framework next week. Watch for Japan's formal ratification timeline. Watch for the Federal Reserve's statement on dollar demand projections. Watch for the White House response, which will come not as a policy paper, but as a tweet or an executive order or a threat. And watch the bond market Monday morning, because if Treasury yields spike on foreign selling, the financial markets will tell you everything you need to know about where this is heading. For 80 years, the world traded on American terms because they had no choice. Today, for the first time since 1944, they have a choice. And 40 nations just made it. The cruelest part of this story is that it was entirely preventable. If the tariffs had been targeted instead of universal, if the diplomacy had been collaborative instead of coercive, if the president had treated allies like partners instead of vassals. But that is not what happened. What happened was a year of economic warfare against the entire planet, and the planet just fired back. Not with missiles, not with sanctions, with a trade deal, with spreadsheets and tariff schedules and rules of origin protocols. The most devastating weapon in the 21st century isn't a bomb. It is an alternative. And Mark Carney just handed one to 1.5 billion people. The era of American economic unilateralism is over. The question is whether Washington realizes it before the last ally walks out the door. Subscribe, stay tuned. The architecture of global power is being rebuilt. And for the first time, America isn't holding the blueprints.